On this very spot, the French surrendered to Germany, and that happened in June 1940. But by that time, a large part of France was still in French hands. So this raises the question, why didn't the French fight till the bitter end in 1940 during the German invasion of France? That's what you're gonna learn today.
It was May 15th, 1940, and the Germans had broken through at Sedan. British Prime Minister Winston Churchill phoned with his colleague Paul Reynaud, who said the war was lost. On the 20th, the Germans reached the Channel coast, and this meant that large contingents of Allied troops were now trapped. But was the war really lost? Couldn't the Allies launch a counterattack? And what about the French troops in the south? Why was Paris abandoned without a fight? Couldn't the French conduct house-to-house fighting or mobilize partisans like they had done during the Franco-Prussian War to fight behind enemy lines? Let's explore. Now, the historian Karl-Heinz Frieser wrote an interesting take on the 1940 campaign in the West, and he pointed out the 6 fatal mistakes the French made at Sedan. First of all, neglecting the Sedan sector. The commander of the French Second Army, Charles Hunziger, didn't think Sedan was a vulnerable place in his front because he expected the Germans to move east to attack the French Maginot Line from behind. Therefore, his best troops were located on the right flank of Sedan. The Gaulier Gap at the northern tip of the bend of the Meuse River was a yawning 1.5 kilometer wide gap. Thus, the Germans were able to cross the Meuse River relatively undisturbed at this important place. The south bank was an ideal place for placing mines. But not even that had been done, which brings me to the absence of mines. See, mines are ideal to stop enemy tanks, but the French were in short of mines. Just to illustrate this, a few years later at El Alamein, North Africa, Rommel ordered 500,000 mines. In the spring of 1940, the Germans had actually the same length of front line, but they had to do with 16,000 mines. Construction troops instead of fighting troops. Some argued that the French had built too few bunkers near Sedan, but in reality, well, they built too many. What I'm trying to say is that most of the troops were busy with construction work prior to the German advance instead of training. So therefore, these troops were more skilled in construction work rather than fighting. The principle of rotation. The French had a confusing rotation system. Companies were repeatedly taken out of the line for either construction work, work in agriculture, or training. And after this, they were mostly employed not in their former sector, but rather in that of the unit that relieved them. This meant that they no longer returned to their positions, which they themselves had built and with whose surrounding area they had become familiar, inserting the 71st Infantry Division into the front line. Due to the constant reshuffling and disintegration of the 55th Infantry Division in the meantime had reached worrisome proportions. On the 10th of May, the 71st Infantry Division, which had been held in reserve until then, was to be inserted in the front line. These were French B reserve troops, and now they were facing the spearhead of the German army. Rumor began to spread that the Germans had already crossed the river and that they were about to be cut off, and thus panic spread like wildfire. A spirit of every man for himself began to take hold, and also a lot of these B reserve troops were World War I veterans. They had survived the First World War and they did not want to die in this fight. After the German breakthrough at Sedan, British Prime Minister Winston Churchill was called by French Prime Minister Paul Reynaud. And Reynaud said to Churchill the following: "We have been defeated. We are beaten. We have lost the battle. The front is broken near Sedan. They are pouring through in great numbers with tanks and armored cars. The road to Paris is open. Send us all the planes and all the troops you can." In post-war year, the Maginot Line was criticized a lot. Some historians called it a huge investment mistake, and therefore attributing to the French defeat in 1940. Now, this is both true and untrue. Untrue. The Maginot Line was not worthless. It had some advantages. First of all, the Germans could not launch a surprise attack. They had to take a detour. The industrial regions near the northeastern border were protected. And also, it would take less men to man the Maginot Line, and keep the attacker at bay, and this could release troops that could be deployed elsewhere. So, however, the Maginot Line itself wasn't that bad. What was bad, or rather called disastrous, was Maginot thinking. While the Germans were developing their concepts of war of movement, the French generals stuck to the defensive mentality of World War I. They had walled themselves in. The bad thing about the Maginot thinking to that extent was represented by passivity, by self-restriction to the defensive, and by foregoing the initiative. That emerged during the fighting in its own country, when the French army could not react to the German breakthrough with an operational counterattack. Perhaps the most important underlying reasons for the quick French defeat in 1940 were social and psychological reasons. The young German soldiers were astonished at the weak resistance. After all, they had been told that the French were going to be tough foes, but even more astonished were the veterans of World War I. After all, they had gotten to know the poilus during the battles around Verdun, along the Somme, in the Ardennes, and elsewhere as a brave fighter. What was wrong with the French of today? The French had won World War I with the help of its allies, Britain and the US. But it can be called a Pyrrhic victory, as France paid the highest price in blood. 1.5 million men died or were missing. This was 25% of the male population between 18 and 27. The trauma, the Verdun complex, was left behind. The war weariness carried well into the 1920s and 30s. France was urged on by Britain to declare war on Germany on the 3rd of September 1939. The French undertook the abortive Saar offensive, and they did not advance deep into the Reich. From then till May 1940, a strange suspended state of war continued, named the drôle de guerre by the French, and the phony war or twilight war by the British, and Blitzkrieg by the Germans. The French soldiers were sitting down doing nothing, sitting behind the illusionary shell of the Maginot Line without any recognizable war aim. Defeatism spread around, and this was effectively exploited by German propaganda. During this period, scenes of fraternization occurred. Signs were put up which read, "If you do not shoot, we will not shoot either." Similar activities occurred during Christmas. Hitler had pursued his rearmament effort camouflaged behind clever peace propaganda. Prior to the war, Hitler had invited pacifists from France and England for personal talks. Many Frenchmen lived in a utopian dream world of pacifism. The French political left was torn when Stalin signed the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939, a non-aggression pact between Nazi Germany and the USSR. And you may find this impossible to believe, but when the Germans marched into France in 1940, they marched through towns and they read French communist posters addressing French soldiers, which read the following text: "Do not fire on Germans, not a single round. Long live Stalin, long live Hitler." I even read about communist workers from France that committed acts of sabotage on French arms plants. Oh, and German propaganda directed at the French also pointed out that it was the British that had got them into this fight, and that when push would come to shove, it had to be the French that had to perform the bulk of the fighting. Also, a secret radio station camouflaged as a communist underground transmitter, Radio Humanité, played a particularly disastrous role in rattling the French population and caused many people to flee southward, deteriorating the French war effort. Roads became blocked by the countless of refugees that were making their way south, and this obviously was not well for French military morale either. On the 20th of May, the Germans reached Amiens. In that evening, they reached the Channel coast. The Allies realized their main armies were now surrounded and they had to perform a counterattack to break out of the pocket. John Gort, commander of the BEF, pointed out his men were defending the line of the Scheldt and couldn't be pulled away. He did allow 2 divisions to make an attack on Arras. The counterattack, although courageously carried out, simply did not have the strength or the French support, except for some cavalry units, to achieve its goal. And this convinced the British that the French had lost the will to fight. The British-French alliance was now doomed to deteriorate, a mutual suspicion and recrimination. On the 26th of May, the British pulled back towards Dunkirk. With Operation Dynamo, the British managed to evacuate 338,000 Allied men. they still had some 100,000 men in the south, and Churchill sent another force under Sir Alan Brooke to keep the French in the war. With the Benelux countries defeated and northern France taken, the Germans launched Operation Wallerode, the second phase in the conquest of France. Now, despite lasting another 3 weeks, Fraser named this operation just an epilogue. The French army had practically no chance of turning the tide because the initial superiority of the Allies in manpower had now turned into the exact opposite. French General Weygand only had 66 divisions. On the other hand, the Germans could now muster 104 divisions and had an additional 19 divisions in reserve. Interesting enough, the second attack initially did not start well. On the 5th of June, Army Group B undertook an offensive to push southwest along the coast. These attacks were stopped with heavy losses. The French had put up the so-called Maginot Line precisely along the line of the Somme and Aisne rivers. It seemed the fighting spirit of the remaining French troops had changed as they offered bitter resistance and now echeloned their defense in depth, setting up a checkerboard-like towns and woods as strong points for all-around defense. But General Rommel quickly adjusted to a new tactic and attacked cross-country and avoided enemy contact and just made deep thrusts into France. On the 10th of June, Mussolini declared war on France and Britain. Not prepared for war, the Italian offensive in the Alps against France was a failure, in which the French lost 200 men and the Italians 6,000. When Churchill met the French leaders once again, he found them in a mood of defeatism. He flew back to London and had no more illusions. On the 12th of June, Weygand discussed asking for an armistice with the French Council of Ministers. Shortly after, an abandoned Paris was captured by the Germans. The French had declared it an open city and had evacuated it. Looking at what the Germans had done to Warsaw in Poland, they feared any resistance might lead to needless destruction. The loss of Paris had a considerable psychological effect on the French. French Marshal Pétain demanded an immediate armistice. Renault allowed him to form a new government to arrange an armistice. The French had suffered 92,000 killed and 200,000 wounded, and nearly 2 million men would end up as POWs. The remaining British troops were quickly evacuated. Hitler insisted on an exact replay of the armistice of November 1918, and the next newsreel culminated with the acceptance of German terms in the same railway carriage in the forest clearing at Compiègne. Afterwards, in a classic compensatory gesture, the carriage was brought to Berlin and exhibited at the foot of the steps to the Museum of Antiquities. The guns fell silent in the early hours on the 25th of June 1940. The Third French Republic was no more. This republic was born after the French defeat at Sedan in 1870, and ironically now died mostly due to the German breakthrough at the same place. Thanks to my patrons, you see their names on the screen, and a special thanks to Rainy Bachtel, Thomas Sapiega, Damian Wallace, Connor, Marcus Kaas, Nick Terranova, Mark Littlehale, Justin Trebell, Tanya Dixie, Susanna Di Bella, Fabrizio, Robert Meehan, David H. Ovett, Wayback History, Michael Brucey, Daniel Holland and Marcus Fielding. A while back I did make a video about the Battle of Verdun on location. Click right here, and did you know that I also made a video about this abortive French Tsar offensive? Click right here. Thanks for watching. Au revoir.